Welcome to Talking Africa on Arise News, a special weekly edition of Africa Wrap, where we take time to reflect on the fortunes and affairs of the emerging continent within its own countries and across the world in an hour of conversation with African commentators, thought leaders and high achievers. Well, time now to welcome one of the continent's leading lights in business. Robert Hersov is a South African entrepreneur and private investor who is now based in London. His family are the founders of the Angloval Group, a prominent mining and financial services company, while Robert himself is the founder of Invest Africa, a platform for business leaders, investors and entrepreneurs to gain insight into Africa and the opportunities the continent presents. Robert Hersov, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Let's start at the beginning. You're of the Hersov family, a well-recognized name in South Africa. Tell us about growing up there.
Well, it's such a beautiful country, and I was born into such a wonderful, blessed and privileged family that it's hard to say that, you know, I wasn't very, very lucky, and I'm very, very grateful. But growing up in South Africa in the 60s and 70s was extraordinary. As a young boy, you live in paradise. But then in the 70s, as you start to mature and realize that you're actually living in a false environment under apartheid, is quite disturbing. And I remember one day, our butler, who I loved, who taught me football, and I absolutely adored him, I wanted to take him to the movies, and someone had to tell me I couldn't take him to the cinema with me. And that was the first time as a young boy when I realized there was something very strange happening out there.
And of course it's evolved, I mean, in an extraordinary pace of change since that time. How do you look back at South Africa today?
Well, I think South Africa's, it's extraordinary what happened. A peaceful transition. It's extraordinary. And if you look back and you think of Madiba and de Klerk, what extraordinary people they, both of them were and are. And where we are today is, I think, in a moment of indigestion. So President Zuma is not taking the country in the right direction. I think he's introducing some bad practices into governance. But I think it's a moment of indigestion. I don't think he and the ANC will be running the country in 5 to 6 years' time.
So a sort of pregnant pause before the country finds its feet again.
Yes.
But of course, you grew up in these extraordinary times in South Africa. Was that where the spirit of entrepreneurship was nurtured in you when you were young there?
Well, my grandfather founded Angloval, which became one of the great mining industrial companies of South Africa. And while many South Africans know about Angloval, it's not well known in the rest of Africa. But he did some other extraordinary things that are not as well known. He founded Sasol. He licensed the Fischer-Tropsch process from Germany, brought it to South Africa, and set up Sasol. In fact, I think the main road in Sasol, I've never been there, is Hersov Avenue. And that has become one of the great petrochemical businesses in the world. He was also developing the Volta River scheme at the time in Ghana, and this was in the 40s and 50s. So he was one of the extraordinary entrepreneurs from South Africa. My father then took the company to another level. But my parents instilled in us as children, said, look, we're going to give you the best education possible. And that's really what you have in life.
And that is the key, isn't it? Education.
Absolutely. Fundamental, never changing. The best thing you can give your children is the best education possible.
Well, you certainly got a good bit of it because you went on to Harvard Business School.
I did.
How important was that for your future? Because I know that people like Len Blavatnik, the Russian billionaire, was in your year.
He was indeed. And I was infinitely richer than him at the time, and he certainly outperformed me. He's a fantastic guy.
Right, but what sort of... how important was Harvard to your future or evolution as a person?
It caught me at the right time of my life. It opened my mind. It opened my mind not just to how the world should operate and best practices, but also the opportunity that the reverse diaspora could bring back to Africa. And it's happening now. There are so many extraordinary educated people returning to Africa because the opportunity is there. And Harvard did give me that worldview.
Yeah. It's a great sort of liberal arts education as well, isn't it? I mean, beyond sort of the business school, it kind of opens up all kinds of hidden parts, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And extraordinary people that you meet there that I've stayed in touch with since then, and the paths they've taken. It was interesting because when I was there, I had finished my military service in South Africa, which was national service at the time. And I went to Harvard Business School as one of 2 South Africans. And a lot of the African Americans would not speak to me because it said in my resume, you know, South African Defence Force infantry officer.
So they thought you were one of the people propping up the sort of the apartheid
whereas in fact
system.
I was anti, but you had to serve. But funnily enough, when I went to my 25th reunion, a lot of them who wouldn't talk to me when I was at Harvard Business School walked up to me and hugged me and greeted me like a long-lost friend, which was lovely.
Yeah, that's nice to know. It's always best to heal and move on, isn't it? But of course, after Harvard, you then began your career at Goldman Sachs in New York.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to follow the investment banking route?
Well, at the time, investment banking really was where everyone wanted to be, and Wall Street was the center, the epicenter of the world. It still very much is in the world of finance. And Goldman Sachs, the leading engine of finance.
Very well-known name, of course.
So I wanted the best training possible. That's what I got.
And then you went on to become the head of the European Media Investment Banking team at Morgan Stanley in London, before then moving on as business development executive at News Corporation in New York for Rupert Murdoch.
Yes.
Must have been quite extraordinary.
I worked for him and directly for him for 2.5 years. And he really is one of the most complete businessmen this world has ever produced.
But it must be a challenge being his business development executive.
Not really. I mean, he's an extraordinary man. He'd hand me a business plan, 2 days later say, what do you think of it? He'd ask me 4 questions, and he'd make his decision on the back of that. He's very intelligent and insightful, and I learnt a lot from him.
And was that one of the things that you think really set him apart, his ability? And that's what makes a leader, isn't it? The ability to take decisions.
Take decisions on limited information and stick with that decision.
Now, since 1999, you've been an investor in a large number and a great variety of companies. I mean, what is it that drives you? I mean, what have been some of your highlights?
Well, there are a number of themes in my life. So I've worked closely with Johan Rupert of Richemont, a more famous South African, and learnt an enormous amount from him about investing on a generational basis, not for short term, for generations. And I've also been in the private jet business. So I founded Marquis Jet in Europe, sold it to NetJets, was vice chairman of NetJets, and now I'm chairman of VistaJet, which is the leading private jet company, certainly in Africa, but also in Russia and Asia. So that's been one theme of my life. But I've also started a lot of companies, not all of which have been successes. And you learn a lot more from failure than you do from success.
Yeah, but leading a private jet company, I bet you could tell a few stories about people in Africa there.
Well, you know, because African transport is so incomplete, it's quite difficult to get from country to country in Africa. A private jet actually...
So what do? Get a private jet.
Of course, get a VistaJet.
You get a VistaJet. Yeah. Have to remember that. But you also founded African Capital Investments, which is a boutique merchant bank which is focused on contributing to Africa's growing middle class.
Exactly.
That's pretty important, isn't it?
What excites me most about Africa is the consumer, the growing middle class. Because country by country, there's urbanization, there's a growing middle class, there's more consumer spending. And what do people want? They want the same as everybody around the world. Better education for their children, better food, security, and a better life. And that's what I want to focus on.
Well, that's a very important part of the evolution and development of, if you like, the economy of Africa, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's the big driver right now. With good governance, improved leadership, people return to Africa, people take opportunities, and we will, our continent's time is now. It really is now. We've got every opportunity to make it what it should be.
That's very inspirational. But you're also known for being a high flyer socially and mixing with a lot of A-listers. Well, certainly with those private jets, I bet you do mix with quite a few. I mean, is that an accurate picture that you're sort of a high flyer A-list mixer?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm not thought of in that way, because I actually, business and family are most important to me. But being in the private aviation business and being involved in some luxury businesses, you know, you are going to meet these people on a regular basis. And there are extraordinary people amongst them doing extraordinary things.
Any people that stand out that you've met in Africa?
Usually in Africa, yes. It's usually the younger generation and the entrepreneurs.
Right. But things haven't always gone so smoothly, have they? I mean, what happened when you proposed to your wife?
Well, my wife is a beautiful New Zealand doctor. And I proposed to her and then I sat on her hand and broke her hand.
Oh, my God. So, how did that happen?
Well, we were taking a water taxi home. We were in Istanbul and taking a water taxi home. And I'd like to say I stumbled, but I think I was just clumsy.
Oh, dear. Well, stay with us. We'll take a very short break here, but when we come back, we'll be talking to Robert about the firm he founded in 2013, Invest Africa. Do stay with us.
The best way to predict the future is to create it.
There's a special breed of achievers out there called tomorrow's people. They imagine what will be and strive to make it happen. They refuse to wait for the future. Tomorrow bends and conforms to their ideas. At Access Bank, we share the same sentiments. Our mantra for success is simple: speed, service, and security. Tomorrow's people own the future because they keep the world turning. That is the power of taking tomorrow.
Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News. Let's continue the conversation with my guest, Robert Hersov, the founder and chairman of Invest Africa, a global private members club which provides insight into investing in the rising continent. How does Invest Africa operate? I mean, you say the vision is to be a global private members club.
Correct. So I set up the Invest Africa 2 years ago on a whim. All my life, people had called me and said, you know, I'm going to Johannesburg, who shall I meet? Or I'm going to be in Nairobi, where shall I stay? Or will you look at this opportunity in Senegal? And my wife said to me 2 years ago, almost to the week, why don't you do something about it? And I said, all right, I will. So it started off very simply as, let's get all the interesting people focused on Africa together, or the ones I knew, some great speakers over some great food and wine, and let's help one another achieve our goals in Africa. And it just took off. And after 2 months, Bob Diamond called me and he said, I love what you're doing. I'd like to be involved. Tonya Cole called me, Ashish Thakkar, and various other people. And it had momentum of its own. So we launched in Johannesburg, New York, London, Johannesburg, New York, Dubai, Geneva, and Zurich. We have 350 members today. We do trips around Africa, conferences, working sessions, regular events, and our aim is to help one another do the right things in Africa.
Well, that's very interesting. You're very keen also to encourage investment in agriculture in particular. You've called Africa the world's breadbasket, or certainly it should be the world's breadbasket. Tell us about that.
You know, there's primary production and there's processing. Primary production is difficult, no matter where you are and how you look at it. And Africa does not produce enough for the local market and for export, but has the best soil, you know, huge potential. And in the past, even in northern Nigeria, there's been extraordinary production which has fallen away. So what I'd like to do is try and return some of this extraordinary agricultural land to its original potential, let alone its future potential.
And of course, Invest Africa is part of that, isn't it? Getting people interested in investing in agriculture.
Yeah, it's not just agriculture, it's all sectors and all countries. But, you know, agriculture is a real passion of mine. It's always been my dream to own a mango farm. I love mangoes.
I love eating.
So if anyone's got a mango farm out there, I'm interested.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to know is, how is Invest Africa actually different from other sort of business, if you like, summits or groups in Africa?
I mean, firstly, we're for profit. So I believe fundamentally in investment and for profit.
Right.
And if you make money, you can then give it away to your heart's content. So Invest Africa is for profit, private members club, but it's focused on decision makers. So we don't really want ambassadors and politicians and headhunters. We want people making decisions, taking risks, committing themselves and capital to opportunities in Africa. And we want to connect dynamic people with dynamic capital. And that's how we differ from the other organizations.
And I expect you would have found a lot of people like that at the World Economic Forum recently in South Africa. I mean, what role did Invest Africa play there?
Well, the World Economic Forum Africa is fundamentally important for the development of Africa. It brings not just local business leaders and politicians together, but more importantly, international investors, and exposes them to people and opportunities. So we were there in force, and it was a superb summit.
Do you think global economic events like the World Economic Forum are important for sealing business deals, particularly for bringing Africans together with sort of the rest of the world, I suppose?
Yes, I do think I think deals get done in places like that, but often not at the conference.
Right.
More often at private homes, restaurants, cocktail parties surrounding the summit.
Did you do any deals down there?
Yes, I did, actually.
Now, over the last decade, 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies have been in Africa, and yet continually we see these images of poverty, dictatorships, bad governance, and that sort of thing. Is the narrative changing around Africa, and if so, how close is your heart to that?
The narrative drives me. You know, there's an Africa of Ebola and an Africa of M-Pesa. The Africa of Ebola is the old Africa. It's dictators and corruption and poverty and strife and bad governance. Today is the Africa of M-Pesa, of technology innovation, of good governance, of extraordinary people returning and making things happen. And that's our narrative at Invest Africa. We want to show the real Africa to the world. But the investment opportunity is exactly that. There's perceived risk and real risk. The real risk is way lower in Africa than people think. And we're educating investors to say you can make great returns with relatively low risk in Africa.
And that's what a lot of people don't realize, is it? Because, I mean, in the West, for example, you make a couple of % on your investment. Yeah. In Africa, you make dozens of percentage points.
Well, it does depend on the sector, the country, and the management team. And that's really what it's down to. Good management is everything.
Now, you're from South Africa. Do you think South Africa is still leading the way in African business?
No, not at all. In fact, South Africa's is looking at its own belly button right now. South Africa's got some serious issues, many of which are not being dealt with. And I think South Africa has lost its way. Whereas other countries in Africa are showing the way. You know, Nigeria, the most peaceful transition of late. Ethiopia opening up. Good things are happening north of South Africa. I'm concerned about my country.
And is that part of that concern to do with, I mean, your family runs a sort of mining company. Is part of that concern about these labor strikes that we keep seeing and hearing about in South Africa?
Well, you know, in the natural resources world, there was a super cycle, almost 10 years of growth. And we're now seeing the downside of that. And it's hurting. You know, people are really hurting in the mining sector generally. In South Africa, it's particularly painful because you've got low commodity prices and intransigent unions that are not helping develop the workforce and doing the right thing. They're just protecting the people that currently have jobs. So they have a political agenda, they have an economic agenda, which is not aligned with what the people want and the industry needs.
We'll take a very short break, but when we come back, we'll be talking to Robert Hersov about how Invest Africa can impact on Nigeria's future. Stay with us.
Wherever and whatever your banking needs, Guarantee Trust Bank will be there, now and into the future. Because you're at the heart of everything we do. Guarantee Trust Bank, proudly African, truly international.
Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News. We're joined by Robert Hersov, whose company Invest Africa has carried out recent research into the Nigerian economy and the impact new President Muhammadu Buhari could have on the country. What have been some of the signs that you've detected from Nigeria?
We are very, very positive about Nigeria and excited about the short to medium term. The long term, who knows? I mean, there are issues that need to be dealt with. And we feel President Buhari knows what they are and has the ability to make the right things happen, and in relatively short time.
But your report also highlights some serious concerns, particularly with the oil industry.
Well, the oil industry is the concern. You know, it's corrupt, it's inefficient, and Nigeria is way too reliant on it. 7% of Nigeria's GDP is manufacturing. So there's an urgent need in Nigeria, and the ability and the capital, to expand the manufacturing sector and to expand the consumer sector and to not be so reliant on oil.
What do you think is the main central most important thing that General Buhari needs to tackle, and tackle urgently with some dispatch?
I think there are 2 or 3 things. One is corruption. He needs to crack down on the corruption in the oil and gas industry. You know, $20 billion stolen a year, whatever the number is. It's completely out of control. That money needs to be diverted back into the economy, into education, into infrastructure. And I just think President Jonathan didn't really want to win because he knew he couldn't tackle that stuff.
Is that what Buhari needs to do to attract business people like yourself?
No. He needs to do that for the medium and long-term well-being of the country. I think Nigeria is a very investable country right now. You have extraordinary entrepreneurs who often come up with their own capital on projects, and you have many sectors that are wide open for opportunity. I think Nigeria is very exciting right now. We like it.
Now, we've seen problems with the banks. They're also tied up with the oil industry. For instance, you've got problems in the... I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, one of the things he's got to do urgently, not just to inspire confidence at home but abroad, is to tackle corruption.
Yeah.
But the extent of it, it's been there for so long. I mean, there are concerns whether he can actually do it in an 8-year period or 4-year period.
I think any steps in that direction are good steps, and he needs to do them. He needs to show he's serious about correcting that illness.
Now, what about the impact of instability caused by the likes of Boko Haram? I mean, what sort of impact is that having on the economy and in confidence of investors like yourself?
Well, there are 2 areas of conflict. There's the Niger Delta, which is a little unstable right now, but I think that can be settled relatively soon. And there's Boko Haram, which prior to the election had been hit pretty hard. I mean, the Nigerian army, with a little help from some friends, had done a very good job in giving them a hammering. And I think it's a relatively easy thing to resolve if you have complete commitment and the right people up there. So we don't see that as a major concern. I'm more worried, by the way, about northern Kenya and ISIS. But the north offers huge opportunity in manufacturing, agriculture, non-oil and gas sectors. And if there can be relative calm up there, investment will come into the north, which is required, and we're big believers in opportunities there.
So what sort of involvement do you see Invest Africa having in Nigeria's future?
Bringing international investors to specific opportunities. So we get presented with, 3 investment opportunities a day at Invest Africa from our members. And the ones from Nigeria tend to be well presented, well organized, and well cooked. So we're looking at 2 power deals. We're looking at a rice processing and farming opportunity. We like manufacturing. We like logistics. Lots of opportunity.
Of course, we know President Buhari is pro-business, and he has stated his absolute distaste for subsidies. This, of course, is in line with your own dislike for publicly owned services. Why do you see those as a drawback?
It just distorts market forces. I think if you're going to encourage investors to invest in a sector, whether it's rice or chickens, yes, you should give incentives to get them in there, but I think distorting the market too much is going to be a long-term problem.
One final thing, Robert. You're bringing the leader of the Democratic Alliance to the UK. Is that this month or next month?
End of this month.
End of this month.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that. What are you planning?
Lucy Mamene is an extraordinary young man. He's 35 years old, and he's heading up the Democratic Alliance. And he was elected into that position a month or so ago. And I believe he'll be running the country in 5 to 6 years' time.
Well,
so, thumbs up to him.
We shall look forward to hopefully seeing him when he gets here, and also following his political evolution.
Thank you, Charles.
Robert Hersov, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us to meet this week's Talking Africa panel as we look back at the week that's been, the big stories, the big issues. We continue the conversation in London with our next guests right here after this short break.
There is a reason Africa is called the new frontier. What was once potential is now an opportunity ready to be seized. Once revered for our resources, today's wealth lies in our people. People who build the cities that shape the future. People who know an idea in one place means business in another. A generation for whom technology means there are no borders, no boundaries. We are the new lions in a brave new world, kings of the urban jungle. And there's a bank that puts the world in our pocket and the future in our hands. UBA, Africa's global bank.
Welcome back to Talking Africa on Arise News with me, Charles Aniagolu, picking up the conversation in London with our special weekly edition of Africa Wrap, where we take time to reflect on the fortunes and affairs of the emerging continent within its own countries and across the world in an hour of conversation with African commentators and thought leaders. Now, the African Union Summit has ended, but with all the fuss over the appearance and then disappearance of the Sudanese President Omar Bashir, the theme of the gathering, women's empowerment, has been somewhat overshadowed. Discussions over the role of women in the workforce threw up some important issues surrounding women farmers and led to calls for the banning of a tool that's been used by millions of African women for generations, the hand-held hoe. Hilary Clark explains.
If hard work alone made you rich, then the majority of Africa's women would be millionaires. Scenes like these, women involved in back-breaking work, are common across Africa, and the most labour-intensive sector is agriculture. Women make up half the continent's farmers, producing an estimated 70% of Africa's food, according to the UN, which is why the African Union Summit that ended this week in Johannesburg called for women's empowerment and that of female farmers in particular to be put at the top of the agenda. An important step to doing this, the conference heard, is to end the use of the hand-held hoe.
Women have just labored. Women have injured themselves with this hoe, bending their backs, sometimes with their children, getting hurt, getting cut and injured by those hoes. Sometimes they break. women who work from sunup until sundown in the fields with this rudimentary instrument that is so difficult for them. I think it's a long overdue.
African women farmers are often also disadvantaged by cultural practices and laws that deny them equal access to land. But women's rights activists are intensifying their efforts to push governments to speed up land reform processes and establish clear legislation securing women's rights to own, access and control land and other natural resources.
Access to land. In too many of our countries, women don't have, because sometimes they have to get their husband's permission. Sometimes there are no land laws that would allow women to own land. Most times land is what they use for collateral to get finances from the bank. So the lack of land means the lack of access to finances. And lack of access to finances means you're constrained in all your development. What are you promoting? What are you building a house? What are you trying to expand your business? So that's a big handicap.
It will be up to African leaders to work out exactly what needs to be done to put women's empowerment higher on national agendas and give women the right tools to empower themselves. Hilary Clark, Arise News.
Well, time now to welcome my guest, Douglas Pollyn from the Association of African-Owned Businesses, and the political and social campaigner, Susan Fajana-Thomas. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Susan, we just heard in that report that a campaign is growing to rid African farmers of handheld tools like the hoe in a bid to empower women. I suppose what it is the symbolism, isn't it? Sort of like the bits, the harness and the whip in Animal Farm and the determination of the animals to get rid of it. Is it a good idea?
Oh, it is a good idea. I find that a bit patronizing, but having said that, it is a good idea, and it's about time that African leaders start doing something about women empowerment. Having said that, there have been a lot of architects of women empowerment in Africa. The point is that they haven't been implementing it. Since 2005, there has been the solemn declaration of equality in funding. There's been the Charter of Human Peoples, but they haven't been implementing it. I think this just concluded summit is bringing the message in that it is about time. Something needs to be done. We don't want to just keep talking about African women empowerment and nothing is happening.
Douglas, I mean, she does have a point there, doesn't she? I mean, you know, this whole thing about getting rid of the hoe is a bit, sounds like tokenism, doesn't it? I mean, you know, the point really is that it doesn't matter what you, because I mean, you might as well, if you get rid of the hoe, what about other things? What about this? Do you get rid of the hoe, give them a scythe, or what do you do? I mean, the point really is to look at concrete ways of empowering African women, I mean, rural women particularly.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to get rid of the hoe. What are you replacing it with? What's the plan? What's the strategy? I mean, if you take that away, are you introducing like a collective of women coming together to do industrialized farming? Because I would imagine the hoe is symbolic of farming by individuals. I mean, like small-scale subsistence farming. If you're taking this hoe away, I mean, what is the plan? What do you plan to replace that with? I think that's what we should be a lot more interested in. Because it's one thing to say, all right, we're taking all the hoes, we want to alleviate the suffering of the African woman. But what are you replacing that hoe with? That's a key question.
But does all this overlook the considerable gains that have actually been made in empowering women? Because, I mean, somebody was in here the other time and was talking about the fact that, you know, what you tend to look at is women at the bottom, which is the rural women and lots of the sort of the subsistence farmers, and women at the top, where you don't have that many of them, although you're seeing more and more of sort of, you know, ministers and all that sort of thing. But in the middle, you've got a big middle class. A lot of the professional people, doctors, lawyers, nurses, engineers are all women, and that's progress, isn't it?
Yeah, it is progress. I think you've actually analyzed the issue in Nigeria, not Nigeria, in Africa when it comes to women. You've got three classes: the rural women, the middle class, the professionals, and you've got the people on top. when it comes to women empowerment, what we want to see, or what somebody like me would like to see, is empowerment from the grassroots, from bottom up. What are we doing, or what are Africans doing?
So lift more people out of poverty,
lift more people out of poverty. What are they doing, people in the rural area, to empower them to cultivate their own? In most African countries, 50% of the population are women. So if you are empowering 50% of the population, you are empowering half of the population. So what are you doing to the women in the rural area? The professionals that are being marginalized are well, they're not any the same as their male counterpart. What are you doing for them? So it's cut across.
And of course, the key element in all of this, Douglas, is education, isn't it? I mean, to lift these women out of poverty, it's not just about taking the hoe away. I mean, you've got to give them something that will replace that and give them sort of other opportunities. But of course, the other thing is access to land. If they are going to be farmers and are going to be empowered as farmers, then they need to have access to land in order to. And of course, the problem is that in many places they can't inherit land, can they?
I mean, you've touched a very sensitive point there. I mean, this is it's a very big problem in Africa, where you've got land ownership being dominated by males because of the culture and because of the social pecking order as well. Like especially in these rural areas where you've got where tradition has a very strong hold on how communities run, you find out that all these lands are being all the land in those rural communities are owned by men. So I think it's something where the government has to step in, where it's seen as the government coming in to own this land, to redistribute this land to rural women. Because if you're hoping on the communities to take initiative and hand land over to women to do actual farming, it's going to take a long, long time for that to happen. So the governments in Africa have to come out and say, you know what, we are creating a program for rural women to help them farm, educate them, give them the equipment they need to farm on a reasonable level, and then hand this over to them and give them a chance to make Africa a much better continent, I think.
Okay, we'll take a very short break here, but when we come back, could Africa's biggest killer have finally met its match? Scientists in Scotland may have found a way to treat malaria in a single dose. We'll have more after this short break. Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News. Now, scientists from the University of Dundee have discovered a new drug which could work well against parasites resistant to current malaria treatments. Concerns have been growing about strains of malaria which are resistant to current treatments on the market, making this new compound a breakthrough in the medicinal world. Our correspondent Juliana Oladipo reports.
Researchers at Dundee University in Scotland have discovered a new compound which could treat malaria. Malaria is a life-threatening disease caused by parasite which occurs mostly in tropical and subtropical climates. According to statistics provided by the World Health Organization, each year there are 584,000 malaria deaths. 90% of these deaths occur in Africa. 430,000 African children die of malaria before their 5th birthday. Early diagnosis and prompt treatment of malaria prevents these deaths. As parasite resistance to treatment recommended for uncomplicated malaria is growing, This breakthrough from researchers is a major discovery in the scientific world and a huge accomplishment for Dundee University.
The World Health Organization estimated that in 2013 there were about 200 million people caught malaria and about 580,000 people died from malaria.
The current anti-malarial treatments that are out there, resistance is beginning to emerge with those drugs. So we need a strong portfolio of new medicines coming through that will replace those.
So the molecule that we have discovered works in a very different way to other anti-malarial compounds.
It actually interferes with some of the machinery involved in protein synthesis, which is obviously essential for the parasite.
So this molecule has potential for treating malaria with just a single dose of compound. It also has the potential to prevent somebody getting malaria in the first place, and it has the potential to prevent the spread or transmission of malaria from infected people.
Scientists behind the project estimate it should cost about $1 per treatment for this new preventative compound, putting it within reach of the most affected patients who live in the world's most poorest countries. Juliana Oladipo, Arise News.
Well, still with me here in the studio are Douglas Pollyn from the Association of African-Owned Businesses and the political and social campaigner Susan Fajana-Thomas. Douglas, is this the super gun that's been awaited for a long time and that Africa so desperately needs to deal with this malaria problem?
I hope it is. I hope it is, because malaria is a terrible problem in Africa. One of the biggest killers, if not the biggest killers in Africa at the moment. You've got over 500,000 Africans dying every year as a result of malaria. And if this is what they say it is, then I think it's the most welcome development of 2015, because to mean a lot of African lives will be saved.
Susan, what impact would a simple single tablet solution be?
It would be a great impact in the sense that if we're able to have a cure to malaria in Africa, malaria impacts the life of people in Africa, as Douglas said. 500,000 people are dying on a yearly basis. A lot of people, it increases both schools and work absenteeism. It decreases economic growth. It caused the public, out of the health public spending, 40% of public spending in Africa are spent on malaria prevention and treatment of malaria. If there is a drug that can tackle all that, that is making life better for people in Africa.
And of course, Douglas, I mean, a critical point in all of that is how much is it going to cost? And if it's a single tablet, then hopefully it'll be considerably cheaper.
I would imagine like the international bodies responsible for looking after health, like the WHO, will step in to subsidize the costs, and African countries as well. African governments will take the initiative to help subsidize the cost.
Well, I mean, at the moment, you can most people walk into shops and buy malaria tablets. I mean, they're able to afford that. So one presumes that if it's a single dose of a single tablet, then it's going to be much more affordable, isn't it?
I hope it is. I really do hope it is, because, like as I said earlier, malaria is a terrible problem. It's caused so much pain in Africa. And I would also mention that in the last 12 years, the African governments have been able to, Africa as a whole, has been able to come together and mobilize to cut down deaths by almost 49%.
That's significant.
Which is quite significant. So I think if more will is expressed, I mean, if there's more determination on the part of the continent, the governments on the continent, malaria will be a thing of the past. Maybe in the next 10, 15 years. Hopefully.
Are you at all concerned, though, Susan, that given that this is a single tablet and what's being talked about is a single dose, I mean, malaria is a powerful, powerful disease, that there may be side effects?
Oh, I think there is no even common aspirin has got side effect. I don't think there will be any drug that won't have side effect, but we should be hoping that the side effect of this drug will not be something that will be creating additional health issues for people who will be using them. And I think there should be, from African leaders, there should be both political and economic power. They should make it a political and economic priority that is not about finding cure. They should have an in-depth, a robust research into the possible side effects. So this is what happened. It affects your mental capacity. It causes liver damage. It causes that. So it will be a good thing at the initial stages to actually have that research side by side.
Douglas, you're part of the African-owned business group in the UK. I mean, does it concern you that every time these research, things are being done, that, you don't hear that some African country has given money, or contributed to the researchers in Dundee to help develop a pill that's going to save lives in Africa? I mean, does that strike you as a bit sort of, strange and odd and unacceptable?
It's a really, really unfortunate situation because it just shows you where the continent is in terms of with vision. I mean, I mentioned earlier how if that will had been there from the beginning, countless people wouldn't have died. You'd have seen the contributions by African governments to research, to develop treatment against malaria. I mean, what I've imagined is there have been an African university that have developed the cure for malaria. I mean, if the will was there to create a cure for this horrible disease, that's what we would have seen.
Right.
But unfortunately, in many of the cases, you see that will is not there, since it's not an economic priority to many African governments.
Well, time now for another very short break, but when we come back, we'll be asking our guests to look back across the last 7 days and pick out a few of the many positive Africa stories that have caught their eye. Stay with us.
Thinking of banking in Africa? Then think Zenith, one of the biggest in Nigeria, with assets over $16 billion, listed among the 20 most influential brands in the world, and winner of Best Bank in Corporate Governance. The most customer-focused bank in Nigeria, a success built on 3 foundations, dedicated to people, technology, service. Zenith Bank, in your best interest.
Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News as we continue the conversation with my guest this week, Douglas Pollyn from the Association of African-Owned Businesses and the political and social campaigner Susan Fajana-Thomas. And we asked you both to highlight some of the positive stories that have come out of Africa over the last 7 days. And Susan, let's start with you. You've seen a new e-commerce course created in South Africa. Tell us about that.
Oh, it is quite, as we all know, in the West, businesses are doing well because of online presence. And this course is being developed in South Africa in the aim to create a good platform for African businesses to be online so that people can transact business online in order to facilitate growth. So, according to this story, in the last, since it started, they've had people enrolling all over Africa.
But aren't they a bit sort of like Johnny-come-latelys there? There's a lot of African businesses already on the internet. I mean, a significant percentage of African business is conducted on the internet, including rural farmers, and that's progress, isn't it?
What this course is doing is actually equipping, giving them tools to be able to grow their businesses online to increase productivity. It's not just about the website sitting online. What do you do with the website? How do you reach more people that will come and do business with you? So it's giving them the tools to be able to do that in order to sustain their business and compete in the world.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Douglas, you wanted to talk about the winners of a $5 million renewable energy fund. Not the winner of the £92 million in the Euro lottery in the UK, but you wanted to talk about the $5 million renewable energy fund, which is, of course, quite relevant and serious. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, it's called the Access Co-Development Fund. It's a fund set up to encourage entrepreneurs in Africa to go into solar, like develop solar energy. I think it's quite fascinating because over 500 million Africans don't have access to electricity. That's almost half of the population of Africa. So there's a tremendous market there. If they are able to develop this solar technology in Africa, is going to change the face of the continent.
So tell us more about who actually won and who's behind the competition.
It's a company called Access Infra Energy, I think, and you've got two winners, one from Nigeria, one from Cameroon, and the Cameroonian winners are looking to power a whole city with their winnings from this fund, and I think they're going to be producing about 20 kilowatts. Probably £1 billion is committed to solar development in Africa, in Nigeria or Cameroon or somewhere else in Africa. So
that's a very interesting one. We'll watch that. Susan, you've spotted that a new disease control center to help prevent and control infectious disease is to be built in Liberia. It hasn't been built yet. It's just being talked about.
It's just being talked about. This is about the signing agreement between the American energy company Chevron and JFK Medical Center to establish this center, as you've said. But if you remember, this is part of the after of the Ebola crisis. This time last year, it was about Ebola. How can they curb Ebola? So this is interesting in the sense that he's saying to people, yes, Ebola has come and gone.
Yeah, but we need to put a healthcare system in place to prevent that sort of thing happening.
To prevent that sort of thing happening.
Well, that's interesting. Now, Douglas, the European Union is supporting the establishment of the Ghanaian accreditation body. What's the reason behind that?
I think it's an effort to help African business be on par with African businesses be on par with businesses across the world. Because if you've done business with companies in Africa, you find that one of the things that is lacking is the commitment to high standards in terms of how much quality they deliver. Work hard to come up to meet that standard. So I think it's something that will really help Ghana as a country.
So how are they actually going to help set this up?
What they are doing is they're trying to make this standard the same with the ISO international standards. The European Union is stepping in to share their expertise to help Ghana create this system that would, in effect, help the West African region play on a level field with the rest of the world.
Right, and that's just happening in Ghana.
In Ghana at the moment, which is quite a very big step for Ghana. I think they are going in a very good direction with that.
Okay, Douglas, Susan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
My thanks to Douglas Pollyn and Susan Fajana-Thomas, and me, Charles Inigolu, and from the entire team here in London, goodbye and thank you for watching.